So welcome everyone to Media Arts Futures in Conversation with Evan Narcisse. This event is sponsored by the Department of Cinema and Media Arts in the School of the Arts, Media, Performance and Design at York University. My name is Alison Humphrey, and I'm a PhD candidate in Cinema and Media Studies, doing a research creation dissertation using participatory science fiction storytelling for civic, scientific, and media literacy. I'm also teaching a course in writing for games in interactive media, which was the impetus for this whole event. I was really thrilled when Evan agreed to speak, as I'm a lifelong nerd who read X-Men comics as a teen and did a summer internship at Marvel in college. But while I was growing up, my mother was studying segregation in Detroit, which is the subject of the video game Dot's Home, on which Evan was the lead writer. And my aunt was writing a book on technology, gender, and power in Africa, so I was thrilled with his innovations in all those fields on the graphic novel The Rise of the Black Panther. So it is my great honor to introduce our guest today, Evan Narcisse. Evan works as a writer and narrative design consultant in video games, comic books, and television, often focusing on the intersection of Blackness and pop culture. As a journalist and critic, he's written for The Atlantic, Time Magazine, Kotaku, and The New York Times, in addition to teaching game journalism at New York University and appearances as an expert guest on CNN and NPR. He's also the author of The Rise of the Black Panther graphic novel and a contributor to Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales, Redfall, and Marvel's Avengers. A native New Yorker, he now lives in Austin, Texas. Welcome, Evan. Oh, and you're muted. So sorry.
Let's try that again.
Classic.
Thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate you asking me and the enthusiasm and your introduction. I really appreciate it.
It's so great to have you virtually here in Toronto. So I'm just going to start out. First question, this event is a part of a course on writing for games and interactive media, but I'd like to start with a question about reading. As a cultural critic, you've reported on the work of writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he was a consultant on your comic Rise of the Black Panther. In a New York Times interview with someone else during his own legendary run on Black Panther, Coates said that reading as a fan is very, very different to reading as a creator. Maybe reading as a critic is close to it, but actually trying to figure out what people are doing and why it has certain effects on me is a very, very different way of looking at stuff. So you started out reading as a fan, then moved to reading as a critic, and now a creator. What has each of those kinds of reading been like for you?
Wow, that's a great question. And I'm kind of mad at Coach for setting up such a thorny one as an opener. That's okay. I'll scold him about it later. So reading as a fan was and is. I'm still a fan. I want to act like I've moved past that mode. Reading as a fan was, I think, expansive and exploratory. You know, going back to my first interactions with comics and other speculative fiction, it was all about like, what are the horizons I'm going to visit, right? Like, what is the state of these fictional universes that I'm entering into, and how do the people who live there, grapple with the fantastic and the mundane, right? Like I think good speculative fiction stories always have a mix of those things, and where they intersect and where the fantastic changes the mundane, or vice versa, right? So that was like reading as a fan. Reading as a critic is, kind of adding another interpretive layer and figuring out, okay, the creators involved in this project, how are they creating the fantastic, right? How is it meant to harken back to the real world that we all live in? How is it meant to diverge from the real world? Where do they imagine better futures or possibilities for the people in the fictional universes? And what their motivations might be, how it talks to other work in a similar genre or in the same character, for example. Like especially in comics, you see characters handed off from different creative teams, one to another, right? So what do they keep? Why do they keep it? What do they change? What are the proclivities of a certain creator? So that was reading as a critic. And it's similar to reading as a creator, but now you're the one who has to do it, right? So like on a project like Rise of the Black Panther, it was very intentional that I kind of spoke to and invoked the character's publishing history because it was meant to be an introductory text, but I also want to like, you know, communicate all the different modalities that T'Challa has existed in prior to my being able to write him. So, you know, you got to figure out your place in the quilt, you know, in the fabric, you know, like okay, what color am I going to add? What insight, you know, and you read and recontextualize everything that's come before you. It's kind of purpose driven, you know, like, okay, what tool does the Jack Kirby run on Black Panther give me, right? What tool does the Christopher Priest run on Black Panther give me, right? How can I sharpen that? How can I utilize it? You know, or at the very least honor it, you know, acknowledge its existence. So I think reading those three different modes is something that you're probably going to continue to do once you become a creator. It's definitely harder to read as a fan sometimes because once you cross the threshold, it's like, oh, okay, you kind of know what tricks certain creators are doing. You know, like ever since I started writing comics, now I obsessively count panels on a page, right? You know, I was given some guidance like, oh, these men, too many panels on a page will crowd a page. So like when I see the count edge up, I'm like, how are they doing that? Why can't I do that? Like so on and so forth. So it is a change, but like I still very much am a fan of what other people are doing in comics and the other media I work in.
That's so cool. I wonder actually, like, if you had been a critic around during Jack Kirby's run or Christopher Priest's run, what would you have wanted to write about?
Wow. So yeah, Priest Panther one was I was just getting out of college and really hadn't gotten my feet wet as a critic yet. I've written about it after, but not during. And you know what's really funny is that was during a period of fandom where message boards were kind of like all the rage, right? Precursors to the social media that we use now. And Priest was on some of the boards that I was visiting during while his run was released. And I remember one comment of mine he responded to directly. It was an issue uh, where Captain America and Black Panther were talking about Captain America meeting T'Challa's dad, and I think T'Challa's line was something, I am, you know, but the mere shadow of he who came before me, the great King T'Chaka. And I said it on the message board how I like that line because it felt like almost religious and spiritual. And yeah, he said he replied that it was meant to be very Christ-like. Again, I'm going off memory here. God knows if these message boards have ever been archived. I promise I'm telling the truth or some version of it. But yeah, so you know, the Kirby run, you know, it's funny. As a critic, I would have probably written something about how there's so much dissonance by compared to what directly preceded it. You know, the Jack Kirby Black Panther comics, I think starting like 78 or 79, and they come after Don McGregor's tenure on the character in Jungle Action, right? Don McGregor being one of the most influential Black Panther writers. He basically helped flesh out like the inner workings of Wakanda as a state, its politics and its cultural clashes. So really rich stuff in terms of development of the character. Kirby used none of it. And he's Jack Kirby, he doesn't have to, right? You know, he's a character, T'Challa's a character that he co-created with Stan Lee. And, you know, he's like, okay, I know what this character is about, you know, and he had a specific mode he wanted to do stories in. And that mode, you know, completely ignored everything that preceded it. So it's a weird kind of outlier. So when I got to touch T'Challa, I was like, well, how can I make this make sense? You know, like the thing about Marvel that's different from DC, from like a comic book nerd perspective, is that Marvel really eschew reboots. Like they don't reboot their continuity. They don't change everything. They don't change the kind of like history. So you know, the idea is that like everything published happened in these characters' lives, right? Like it's up to like creators and fans, kind of in a collective effort nowadays, to work out the timelines and how it all makes sense. But everything happened. So like if everything happened, if Jakara actually exists, you know, and hasn't been mentioned ever since the Kirby run, how can I work him in? What you know, what's a backstory I can give him that motivates him to do the actions that we then see later in the Kirby run. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going too deep down the rabbit hole, Allison. So I mean, you got to guide me if I'm going too deep into nerddom.
This is the nerd rabbit hole for the next hour. So welcome all
Okay.
rabbits. Awesome. So just to kind of like, because I'm definitely coming back to some of the stuff that you just said, but to kind of go back to the fact that you sort of started your career as a journalist and a critic covering comics and video games, pop culture, or as you've put it, nerd culture, and you even taught a university game on a university course on game journalism at NYU. I'm just wondering, what did you teach your students about the role of a critic in our culture?
Well, it's funny. Again, I have to go off memory here because I taught that course many moons ago, and I'd be remiss in not saying that the course was originated by my friend Chris Plant, who's currently the editor in chief of Polygon. And a quick funny story: Chris taught the course, and then decided he was going to move to Austin, just for life reasons. And then I taught the course in Austin too, and I don't think it was offered again after I taught it. But yeah, it was a weird coincidence. But yeah, in that course, how did I talk about the role of a critic? I'm going off memory here, but probably as an interpreter. Like the critic has to serve multiple roles, right, to multiple audiences, right? Especially when you're talking about like a medium like video games, where there's a hardcore fan base that's usually well informed about the experiences they engage in, right? So like who makes the game, what the mechanics are, whether it's an evolution of stuff that's seen previously before. So that's, the hardcore audience, right? And they also have certain hidebound attitudes about, the material, which I'm not necessarily going to get into, but like you have to talk to that audience, right? Acknowledge them. Also, people who are new, right? Who've never necessarily played a video game before, right? And might need, a kind of introductory explanation about, like, what is a game as a live service game, for example. It's the term, a jargon that's used in video games. It means it's a game that launches and then gets content added onto it for its whole lifespan, whatever that may be. So like Avengers was a live service game. And yes, Miller, I'm riffing off your question in QA, which I'll answer when it's time to answer that. But yeah, so you have to explain, various facets of video games writ large as a creative medium and a business industry, to the new reader, right? And but I think ultimately the critic's first and most important job is to reckon with their own reactions to a creative work, right? So it's like, okay, if I saw the Angry Birds movie and hated it, which I did, like, why did I hate it? What explain the reaction? Why do I think it's not worth your time or money? There is like a service element to cultural criticism that is still very important, right? Should I waste my time and money on an experience that I might not necessarily enjoy? So all those things, like what the critic's job is to provide cover for creators or companies or corporate entities, right? I'm not saying you have to go out of your way to attack a creator, but like if they're due some sharp criticism, then deliver that. And I've done that, like with very few regrets. I'm thinking here, who would I least want to meet of somebody who I wrote a harsh review of? And I can't answer that question without incriminating myself, so I'm pleading the fifth on that. But yeah, that's what a critic's job is. I feel like, the most wrong-headed attitude about cultural criticism is that, like, you're supposed to co-sign the work and what it's saying, or the creators, or an audience's prevailing reaction. Like as an individual critic, you're not always going to like what the masses like, or vice versa. And you just have to be able to explain your truth. Like I always used to say in class and anecdotally to people who want to know about what cultural criticism is like, is yeah, you're delivering an opinion, right? And everybody has opinions, but like the critic's job is to offer an informed opinion, right? So like informed by a history of the medium that you're talking about, the creators that that might be doing the work that you're discussing, or your own kind of inner kind of architecture and why a creative work pings off of it a certain way, right? So like, I've gotten personal in reviews that I've written about, like, stuff in my family life or whatever, and how it's affected the way I receive certain work. And I think that's fair ground, like it may seem like navel gazing to some people, but like, you don't sit down and watch a movie like, I don't know, Drive My Car, the new movie that's adapted by from a Haruki Murakami short story. You don't watch something intensely personal and then not reflect on your own personal experience. So I think critics are able to invoke their personal experiences in a work of criticism. So yeah.
Fantastic. And in fact, that gives me a really good segue to sharing a video that you put together as a sort of trailer of some of the stuff that you've worked on, starting, in fact, from talking about your own background.
There's no music, yo, so sorry.
Silent film.
Yeah. Note the date, some of that stuff. I was way ahead on Miles Morales. There's my boy, our boy, my shared cousin.
With his awesome haircut. All right, so so the question, kind of rewinding to one image back before Miles, coming into your run on Black Panther, I'm going to use another quote. This one from writer Jonathan Hickman when he was soft rebooting the X-Men comics more than a half a century into its run. He said, "This is something I've been writing and rewriting in my head since I was a kid. I've been in the kitchen for a long time with it. I get the ingredients. I get what makes a good meal." So I'm wondering, what did you take as a creator from your time in the kitchen with Black Panther?
Man, first of all, Hickman sounds super confident in that quote. And I'm just like, how? Teach me your ways, Jonathan, who I don't know personally, but I love his work. You know, on good days, I feel like I'm delivering a good meal with my Panther work. Definitely a robust meal with lots of courses. It's like one of those Brazilian steakhouses where they just keep bringing out meat on skewers for you. Hopefully you didn't tap out and you finished. You got all the way to dessert. Anyway, I'm torturing this metaphor. I mean, the Black Panther mythos in particular is something where, yeah, I have thought about the work a lot before I actually got to touch the character and his universe. And there are questions I had to, if I could say anything about Rise of Black Panther, it's like there were a lot of questions I've been asking myself about Wakanda as a fictional construct that I wanted to answer, offer some answers on the page about. And, a certain point of view that, was empowered in part by some of the work that Ta-Nehisi was doing on the main title, and so it's like, okay, if this is a place that has real history, right, it has real politics and real like cultural mores, I always mispronounce it, I should just say norms. Anyway, that has, all the aspects of an actual society in fictional form, right? Like, what are the things that we don't know about Wakandan statecraft? What are the things that we don't know about inheriting the mantle, about the personal histories of the characters that we've seen before, right? So, like, to me, the Black Panther stories that I always enjoyed prior to writing them were the ones that touched on that stuff, right? So it's like in the Don McGregor run, like Kantu is a character, right? So who's a young boy who suffers like terrible tragic loss during Killmonger's campaign to unseat T'Challa, and then winds up being the person who knocks Killmonger off Warrior Falls, right? So, the relationship between T'Challa and Kantu in those books was something that was really moving to me, right? And then McGregor revisits Kantu later in a separate series. So like you see him, okay, how does Wakanda, a seemingly perfect nation, right? Like, are the youth disaffected there? If so, why? You know, like, so it's like, okay, it gives you a little bit of personal insight into this character who, you know, otherwise is like having, you know, rather typical superhero adventures. And, you know, with Priest, it was like, okay, uh, the general premise was like, we don't know this person at all, right? You know, like he's been in the background of group shots with the Avengers, but like he has a level of responsibility that far exceeds, you know, most other superheroes, right? And how does he carry that weight? And you know, if you're read Priest and lots of the comics after, it's sometimes reluctantly, right? You know, he doesn't glory in being a ruler. So like again, going off their previous understanding, in particular from Priest, it was like, well, he kind of had to take on the mantle because it was expected, right? But like, what happened before? You know, who was the regent? You know, and what did his uncle Cyan have to deal with politically and personally and psychologically, right? The whole part of the reason the threat that T'Challa deals with in Rise of the Black Panther exists is because Cyan saw his brother get shot down by outsiders, the first king to fall, you know. And so then another question was, what did that do to the national psyche? You know, the inherent suspicion and isolationism that runs through Wakandan culture, like, you know, probably only hardened, right? And then how does T'Challa, with all his aptitude and personal experiences, react to an increasing sense of isolationism in Wakanda, as represented by his uncle, right? And his thought was to, we can't do this. It's gonna wind up making us more of a target, and it's going to fossilize our culture. It's going to freeze it in time, you know, because we're not interacting with the outside world anymore. I kind of believe that T'Challa opens up the country to enable an exchange of ideas. I wrote those lines when he went to the UN and was like, you know, Wakandans need to learn how to trust. You know, like that's our big flaw. So yeah, like those were the questions, you know, like that were floating in my mind. Like, you know, can I answer some of these? Like, and then there's some like more kind of brass tacks continuity questions. Where the hell did Jakara come from? You know, like he's a half brother of T'Challa. Well, Kirby just introduces him as like this threat over the course of a couple of issues, but never talks about his parentage, never talks about why he feels like he has a right to the throne, you know, never explains why he can never exercise that right, that privilege that he has of succession. So I wanted to talk about that stuff. And you know, like the other thing was, okay, I decided that you can treat the murder of T'Chaka as like a political act of assassination, right? So like, how does, again, that feeds into the isolationism, you know, and then it falls on his son to kind of reverse the isolationism. So like, you know, I was trying to hit at some existential stuff, but also like compare and contrast T'Challa with other characters who have a similar social station within the Marvel universe, right? So that's Namor, who's also a king, right? But more of an anti-hero. You know, Dr. Doom, who's also a ruler, but you know, a straight up villain, depending on who you ask. So stuff like that, right? Like, how does he re-encounter Storm, who he met as a teenager, once he becomes a ruler, right? So these are the questions, you know, and I kind of wanted to treat it as like a backdoor, you know, secret origin story for Killmonger, right? Who again, and you're in the Don McGregor run when he shows up. He's just there. He's like, oh yeah, I was exiled from Wakanda. I asked the king to take me home, and he did it like without question. So I want to complicate that a little bit. And you know, one of the stories I like to tell is I had no idea what Ryan Coogler and Joe Robert Morgan, who co-wrote the screenplay with Coogler, were doing when the movie was being made, right? And I'd already decided and was approved to use, you know, Killmonger as a villain. But like the fact that we both wound up with like, here's an origin story for Killmonger. And the reason he's so messed up is because he grew up outside of Wakanda. When I saw the movie, I was like, damn. But you know, rather than feeling like, undercut in any way, it was like this just speaks to the notional strength of the character, right? Like, and the way he speaks to a certain um fact of existence for people in the Black diaspora, right? Like, we know we come from Africa, right, generations ago, but like there's no real cultural connection to the ancestral homeland. And so you wind up having to imagine it in different ways. Sometimes you're feeding off the cues that society tells you, sometimes you have something else, but like it's not actual lived experience in a place that you're supposed to feel connected to. And what does that do to you? Um, so yeah, terribly long question, rather answer, Allison, and I'm sorry.
Oh my God! Don't apologize. That was brilliant. Fantastic. Okay. Just to make sure that we can actually get through some of the rest of your oeuvre by the end of the hour, I'm just going to ask one more question about Black Panther and play a little bit of video over top of it so that you can either talk to it or speak apart differently. But I read that you pitched a focus on T'Challa's late mother, Niamey, as the source of his scientific mind, sort of echoes of Shuri in the movie. And I'm wondering if you can use this example to talk us through your process of writing from pitch to outline to script.
Yeah. Um, let's roll the video first if we're going to do that. Is there sound? I don't remember which video this is. Anyway, we'll see. It's a surprise.
So no sound on this one.
Yeah. So, Inyami was interesting to me because, you know, if you read the text closely, um, you know that Ramonda, um, who raised T'Challa, is not his birth mother, right? And I was thinking about T'Challa's heritage and you know all the things that make him who he is, right? And he's a strategist, he's a planner, he's a statesman, a politician, and those are things that he would conceivably have learned from his dad, right? And his tutelage. But his aptitude for science was something that stuck with me. I was like, we never saw T'Chaka being like in a lab anywhere, right? Like inventing stuff or doing any kind of like scientific inquiries. And one of the things I thought is, hey, you know what? What if he gets this from his mom? And again, I was drawing on personal life experience, right? My child was a very avid reader, and they love to read, and I connect that to the way I used to love to read when I was their age. And we all know like there's a nature versus nurture thing when it comes to being parents and kids. And I was like, well, what if he gets a scientific aptitude from his mom, who we never really knew, but he owes her this great debt in terms of the makeup of who he is. And there's a certain mournfulness about that heritage that he kind of continues on from her. So uh, you know, moving across the different stages of writing, that was something I pitched to my editors and they agreed with it. And then it was like, okay, you know, she has to die. I wasn't going to rewrite history. She has to die early on in his life. But like, one, let's show her doing the things that she did. Let's show her impact on Wakanda. Let's show the courtship between T'Chaka and her, right? To give a sense of who she is, and then figuring out parts in the story where we could call back to that. That was part of the outlining process. And Allison, the most wonderful thing about what I got to do with Inyami was it got picked up. Like Ta-Nehisi used it as one of the motivators for T'Challa to go into space when he did the Intergalactic Empire of Wakanda run. And he talked about it in passing. We're friends. We text every so often. And he's like, "Yeah, I'm gonna do this," and I kind of forgot about it, like whatever. And then the issue comes out, wonderfully drawn by Jim Bartel, and I got very emotional. I was like, wow, he really used this. And the thing about that is twofold. It's like, one, your work gets repurposed in an additive way, right? Which like to me is like the juice of superhero comics, right? That's the energy. That's one of the things that makes the form so different and energetic compared to other forms of storytelling. Like, you inherit a character where dozens, if not hundreds of people have touched it before you, right? And all of that work can inform your work, right? Like you were working in a continuum, right? And that's, I mean, so few mediums can say that, you know. Like the only ones I can think of, like, or maybe soap operas, right? Like, you know, and maybe I'm not thinking deeply enough, but like uh that felt good. But the other reason it felt good is because it's like this is what made me fall in love with superhero comics, you know, as a younger person, right? Like seeing, you know, Chris Claremont take a character like uh, uh, Misty Knight and Colleen Wing, and yeah, he's working on them in Iron Fist, but they also show up in the X-Men, but they also show up in some other stuff too, right? So like, you know, you change the status quo of these characters, and you know, Daredevil is another example I used to like to invoke. Like, you know, his aggregate personality like really only changes once Roger McKenzie and Frank Miller touched that character, right? In the late 70s, early 80s. And you know, yeah, we all understand Daredevil to be like, you know, an intense, brooding, you know, occasionally self-destructive superhero. But like that only happened within the last, I don't know, 30, 40 years of its existence. You know, he had a whole kind of different personality before that. He used to crack a lot more jokes, you know, like he was basically Spider-Man, but a little bit more grown up and less broke. So the fact that, hey, something you did may become part of the continuing legacy of this character who will probably outlive me, you know, and has become a touchstone for people in the real world in this really meaningful way. Like that's pretty freaking cool.
Words to live by. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so as much as I would love to talk comics the whole time, let's move on to seeing the trailer for Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales, the video game. I wonder if you can kind of talk us through what you did on the game and how different it is writing for video games than for a linear form like a comic book.
Oh man, it depends on the kind of game, right? Um, so writing for video games is tricky because you can be telling a linear story, right? But depending on the structure of the game, nowadays a game like Miles Morales, for example, was kind of an open world format, right? So you know, you can tackle a part of a chapter of narrative, right? You can see a mission from beginning to end that advances the story. But because of the format, you can also do other things in the world, right? So you've got to write to different scenarios and situations, right? Has a player met this character that might give them a different quest? Has the player advanced to a certain part of the storyline where, oh, okay, they can reflect on the things that happen, right? And you can play all these things out of sequence and out of order, right? So you got to write while always keeping player agency in your mind, right? Like when I was working on Redfall, you know, it was like, oh wait, but this character might not have interacted with this enemy before, so we have to be like, okay, here's the first contact dialogue, you know, what we call BARTs, which are short lines that usually speak to a situation if the character is hurt or whatever. So what I did on Miles was just a range of things, right? I read the whole script, you know, I worked with the other writers on the game, lead writer Ben Arfman and Mary Kenny, who become dear friends to me. And you know, like figuring out, okay, how can we make Harlem feel like Harlem in the real world, right? I lived there for about 5 years, you know, and like Miles, I moved from Brooklyn to Harlem, so it's like, okay, I know what it's like to feel out of place, despite it being part of the same city that you lived in your entire life. Learning to learn the new kind of like, you know, vibes of a neighborhood, right? Like, okay, like, you know, there is a difference between Brooklyn and Harlem, right? Probably less so than there was back in the day, but like, you know, what is that like? Being the new kid, you know, but also having to be a new superhero, right? You know, the specificity of like him being a Black Puerto Rican kid, right? You know, like I come from a Caribbean background. My parents are Haitian. They immigrated here in the late 60s, early 70s. And, you know, I know what it's like to grow up with another culture in your background, right? Even as you are figuring out, mainstream American culture and your place in it, right? But also like, okay, don't forget, you know, uh, uh, the food from where we come from, or the language, or stuff like that. So, um, but I have to say, like the team at Insomniac, they already had a lot of this in mind, but I think I was just able to be an added resource and help them refine stuff. Um, certain beats of the story, like I wanted to make sure were always top of mind. Some of the beats that kind of like coalesce into the ending, I was a champion for. Um, and also, I wrote and helped design some of the side quests. One in particular about the neighborhood, where you're trying to help people in the neighborhood, and the culmination of that. So that was one, and I wrote most of the dialogue and scenario for one of the side quests where you have to collect the time capsules. So and like I said, you throw a little bit of yourself in there. There's one of the collectibles is like a scratch art pad that Finn used to use, and that's because my daughter was obsessed with those for a while. So it was funny when I got the game and sat down and played. She was sitting and watching me. Oh, this is the game you worked on, and then we found that particular collectible right when she was sitting next to me. I was like, yeah, I put that in because of you, and she was like, oh, cool. So yeah, she may have said something else other than that, but she's not here, so I get to. But yeah, that's what it was like working on that game, and working on, the Black Panther expansion for Avengers was different because it was a different structure, and they wanted different things and insights from me. So the gig changes depending on what the project is, but Miles will always be near and dear to my heart. Yes, there was a cat at the end, Brianna. That's you kind of got to play the game, but it's a cat that you rescue for a local bodega owner that you can then take with you on the adventures. I'm sorry, I love it so much.
It's fabulous that you kind of talked about his place in the neighborhood, and the way that through the app and through his traversal of the space, he actually connects with his environment, and that kind of brings me into Dot's Home, which is a game that is an indie game that you worked on as the lead writer. Very, very different budget, very different scale, but with, in a way, similar themes of community,
Yes, yeah,
neighborhood. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about that. We actually studied it in class this week.
yeah. That's one was interesting because um, its conception comes from a different place, right? It comes from a place of like civic mindedness, right, and political awareness, right? So the project started as one of a suite of projects under the Rise Home initiative, right? Rise Home Stories initiative, right? It's a cohort of housing justice organizations that want to use storytelling in different media to bring awareness to the kind of issues that face people, whether they're unhoused, underserviced, or finding themselves left out of situations where they could have a safe place to stay. So, very much it was programmatically kind of designed to be like, okay, here's the lessons we want to have the player receive, right? What's a way we can do that? And when I sat down with the other developers and creators in the game, one of the things we hit on was these issues get lived through historically over time, and having different members of one family be touchstones for dealing with these issues throughout the decades was, something that I helped bring to the table. And, figuring out how do we talk about, society and its ills and its injustices, and the corners you get painted into and the false choices you're presented in a way that doesn't feel like making the player eat their vegetables, you know, and also like showing some consequences that are dramatic but also still realistic. So, it was very much a labor of love for everybody involved, like talking about Detroit, a city where, the narrative around home ownership has been so tumultuous, like Detroit was a city back in the early 20th century during the Great Migration, where Black people from the South, in search of better means and better ways of safer ways of living, like moved there, and then, fast forward, almost 100 years, and Detroit gets talked about as this urban wasteland where they're giving away homes because they need to shore up the economy. It was like, well, some of those homes that are being quote unquote given away, people still lived in them. They were foreclosed. They didn't have economic assistance. So it's like you're asking people from outside a municipality to come in and help shore it up economically, while ignoring the people who've been there and helped build it, but also have been, the promise of interconnected systems that take care of you has not been met for them. Like they're finding themselves on the fringes of society. So I thought that was an interesting conflict that we could deal with there. But also, like drawing on the expertise of people who fight these struggles in the real world every day was an invaluable asset. So it was definitely a different kind of project, but I'm super proud of that too. Like getting to portray a Black family across multiple generations is still a relative rarity in video games overall, whether you're talking about big budget AAA stuff or indie stuff. So I was glad we were able to make that mark. And I'm just grateful for anybody who's played it, including your class.
We loved it. It was a huge conversation starter, and I think actually that kind of brings us into a student question at the end of that class, which is like, I know that the whole Dots Home team was creators of color. That was a very conscious decision, but the student, and this is actually a conversation that we had even earlier on in the term, the student's asking, how does one create well-rounded characters from different cultures without somehow crossing a line or being stereotypical? Where and how does one draw the line when taking ideas from different cultures or religions, or addressing issues or problems not of one's own culture for stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. And my short answer initially will be that anybody can do it. Like on several projects I've worked on in comics and others, like you have to write characters from different backgrounds. It's like, just remember that they're human beings. Like start by approaching these characters as three-dimensional human beings, right? And their lived experiences, they're fictional, right? But like, what are the things that make them unique as a person, right? Cultural background, racial heritage, socioeconomic status, those kinds of things. They all inform the way you move through the world, right? So consider those things when you're shaping a character, right? And the other thing is to characters of color, from whether they're from a marginalized group or not, they don't always have to speak to an issue in society. Sometimes they can just move through their story, right? Like I remember there was a game called Remember Me by Don't Nod, who since gone on to become famous for making the Life is Strange games. But this is one of their early storytelling efforts. And their main character was a Black woman, and didn't have anything to say about racial justice or anything like that. There's a lot you could read into it, but I don't think her character suffered by virtue of not having something to say about systemic oppression or stuff like that. So you can approach it different ways. Just if you're unsure about something, do the reading, do the research. There's a lot of writing out there about like what it means to live as a marginalized person, and there is a way to synthesize that stuff without it being appropriative, in my opinion. Okay, there's questions from students in the Q&A box. Are we done with yours, Allison, or I just want to make sure we answer some of these questions.
Absolutely. There's definitely some that follow up on that, but I also wanted to use another one from the class that someone was saying how he loves Genlock, and he was wondering what it's like coming onto a show in season 2. as opposed to
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to be the only writer in the season two room that had worked a little bit on season one. I was a consultant on season one and wrote part of the finale for the first season. So I came in with a working knowledge of the universe and the characters. But you know, we wanted to flesh out the world a little bit and took some big swings as to explaining the factional conflict and the technology and um, um, the backstories of the characters. So it was really daunting. You know, it was you know, a tonal shift that I think um, was a big risk. I think it paid off in a lot of ways, but you know, obviously there's gonna be differing opinions on who's watching the show. But you know, like the main question for me with Genlock was like, okay, once you disembody a human consciousness, right? Um, what else can you do with it? What else can be done with it? What else happens? You know, and you know, we all explored that together as a group, and I think we came up with some really intriguing questions. It's not up to me as to whether that series continues or not, but like, I, I, I think it, you know, based on some of those conversations we had in the room, it can go to some really wild places in season three. But yeah, like, there's an existential core to that work that is really intriguing to me, and you know, hopefully we get to continue it, or somebody else does. You know, I'd love to see what somebody else gets to do with it. That's just life as an entertainment writer. Sometimes you don't always get to continue the work, but yeah.
That's fantastic. And in fact, it feeds into, I'm going to take one of the questions from the Q&A and kind of fold it into this. There's a question sort of about Marvel's Avengers and the War for Wakanda expansion. Obviously, you know, expansion packs in video game series. I mean, I think Miles Morales was a bit of a standalone, not an expansion, but its own thing. And
Yeah.
then, you know, we've got streaming services just expanding the opportunity for series. We've got Wakanda Nights has been announced with you attached to it. So I'm wondering what your feeling is of the future of serialized storytelling.
I do have to correct you, Austin. I'm not attached to Wakanda Nights.
Oh,
That's okay. I know some people who are,
yeah,
and that I can't wait to see it.
my
But
apologies.
you know, speaking to you know the War for Wakanda expansion for Marvel's Avengers, you know, again, that was a case where you know, I was lucky enough to be sought after by the people making that game and give my expertise on all things Wakanda in to them and help write it. You know, the thing for me was like, again, this is another iteration of a character who I've loved. You know, and you know, one of the questions we dealt with was like, how can we make this version of T'Challa different, right? And it was in production at the same time the movie was, and you know, obviously the loss of Chadwick Boseman impacted our production in terms of the level of thoughtfulness and homage and differentiation that we were trying to achieve. But you know, like, okay, the thing is, for me, it all starts with the source material of superhero comics that Marvel has published and T'Challa's appeared in. There's so many facets within that that you can just turn it just a little bit and reflect a different kind of spectrum of light. You know, so for this, you know, we decided T'Challa's a little bit older. He's been king for longer. You know, this is not an origin story. You're not watching him become king. He's been king. But the thread is, how does he evolve his rule, his sensibilities, his worldview to cooperate with other people? You know, there's a big kind of attitudinal difference between him and Shuri in this, which was a lot of fun to plumb. And, you know, he himself was a lot more closer to the Christopher Priest version of the character, right? Where he's closed off emotionally and kind of tries to bear the weight of ruling Wakanda all by himself, which was different than what you saw in the movie, right? You know, the movie was more of a somebody growing into that role as opposed to somebody who's already grown into it and needs to evolve it. So that was really fun. And you know, in terms of my future involvement, you know, all I can say is there's stuff coming that I touched. So I don't think it's been announced yet. So I really can't say anything more. But yeah, there's some very cool stuff coming for that game. Yeah.
Fair enough. Very much.
And shout out to the folks at Crystal Dynamics, Hannah McLeod, chief amongst them, who worked with me on a bunch of stuff. yeah, they're great people over there, and I think it's a really cool game from a narrative perspective in terms of how they told the story of the Avengers, which is a tough thing to do, right? Like you're doing it in a world where everybody knows these characters now. So how do you spin a new story? And I think they found a really great angle. And they sent through Kamala, which was great. Anyway, I'm going to go on. More Q&A questions from the box. And thank you for that question, Miller.
Yes, fantastic. I'm just realizing that we are at 12:30, but given that we sort of started a little bit late, are you cool to go on a little bit?
Yeah, I can go on for a little bit.
Cool, cool. All right, so we've got.
I can just read it. I see the question. I'm gonna take
go for it.
From Marvin Darkwa. Do you believe that you have a certain onus as a Black writer to represent your truth more than your counterparts? The short answer to that, Marvin, is yes, I do. I just come from a place where I know what it's like to be underrepresented, misrepresented, misunderstood, ignored, or redacted from stories altogether. So I'm very cognizant of being a Black creator and telling Black stories sometimes when I get to, and representing my lived experience and figuring out where there's commonality with other Black people's lived experiences too, right? And divergence, right? Like it's, I can't speak for all Black people, but like, I think I have a sense enough of our collective history and lived experiences where I can invoke it. So yeah, it is a responsibility, I think Black folks and other marginalized groups are still underrepresented in entertainment media. I'm very cognizant of being lucky enough to have a shot, and I want to use it to broaden and deepen portrayals of Black humanity and whenever I touch. Like, to me, that's the overarching mission. Like, Black people in our fullness, whether that's struggling or just expressing joy and glory and achievement without the trappings and framework of systemic racial oppression. Okay. There's one in the main chat. If you could see T'Challa through the end, how would you want his story to end? That's an interesting question. And you basically asked me to give story ideas out for free, but like, I think T'Challa's ultimate legacy within the fictional universe of Marvel Comics and the smaller kind of microcosm of Wakanda is always like, he changed Wakandan history, like he opened up a nation that had been isolated and secretive and paranoid to the rest of the world, right? And the rest of the world benefits from that. So, without Wakanda, Captain America doesn't get his shield. Without Captain America's shield, World War II doesn't necessarily get won by the Allies, right? At least in the fictional Marvel universe, right? And T'Challa recognizes his nation's part in global history, right? And I feel like, the character at his end would really have to reckon with that in the big way. So, yeah. Now you got me thinking about Black Panther: The End. Marvel used to do these series called The End, where they would show certain fictional characters at the end of their lives. They did one for Daredevil, I think Punisher. I want to say Saladin did one for Miles too. It was a future Miles thing. But yeah, so now I'm thinking about that. Okay, more from Q&A.
And just let me know when you've got one question before you want to end, and I've got one to wrap it up.
Sure.
Good stuff.
Sure. Okay. From Nicholas Muhammad. I have a functional question and a fanboy question, if that's okay. We'll see, Nicholas. Currently, I am reading for our sector, and I love the representation. What are your recommended stories regarding representation of minority characters, wherein it doesn't necessarily have to discuss minority issues, but show us in the roles the way Remember Me and Far Sector do? Also, what is the status of Jericho Drumm at Marvel? What are your thoughts of him as a character? I can answer the second one first. Jericho Drumm is an interesting character who has this kind of like checkered past, Jericho Drum, for those who don't know, is a Haitian superhero who operated under the code names of Brother Voodoo and Dr. Voodoo. And, he's created in the 1970s. I forget by who. I want to say it was Roy Thomas and Gene Kalan. I'm probably getting that wrong. But, a lot of those Black characters from the 60s and 70s were created without firsthand lived experience of the backgrounds that the creators were invoking, right? So a lot of the stereotypical notions about voodoo and his stories, and it's kind of sensationalistic. But over time he became kind of, those rougher edges were smoothed out, and he became part of like the class of magic users in the Marvel universe. He was even a sorcerer supreme for a while. So I think there's a lot of untapped potential there. And to answer the question more directly, when Marvel was doing their first Marvel's Voices anthology, where they have marginalized creators write about characters who also might have the same background, I wanted to write Dr. Voodoo because nobody Haitian's ever written him before, and it was a short one-page story, and I just wanted to like show him being a superhero in a mode that reflected the historical precedent of the Haitian Revolution, like, which is to say, like, each panel there's like something that's like, oh, he's continuing on that legacy. So there's like the first panel is like there's a ghost slave ship that's trying to steal people away from a plane crash, and he's fighting the ghost slavers. And there's another one where there's a shady corporate meeting in a Roxxon boardroom, and he's disrupting it. Because like there's a really bad history of interventionism in Haitian culture and in politics. And I want to show him as a superhero that saw part of his mandate as to protect against that, and the last panel of that story is him meditating and drawing power from ancestors of the Haitian Revolution, and in front of a statue called Neg Mawang, which is the Maroon Man, and the Maroons were runaway slaves who set up their own communities in the forests and the woods, and were a big part of the revolution. So I want to show Dr. Voodoo as being connected to all of that. So yeah. And for the first part of your question, recommended stories with representation minority characters. I mean, I'm on a big Walter Mosley reading kick now, and I think he does that really well. Where those stories are generally set in Los Angeles from immediate post-war era through the mid '60s, and they're not always about racial injustice and oppression, but like he shows that as like a force of nature in the American body politic. And shows easy dealing with that in ways that aren't always direct, but you never forget that it's there, but it's not always the main point of the story. So I love those novels. What else? I mean, I love Eve Ewing's Ironheart comics for the same reason, right? Like, Riri Williams is not dealing with, gun violence, but she lives in a city and has adventures where people are at risk, right? So her role as a superhero is to protect them because she's suffered loss, but it's not about like politics or mainstream media coverage. It's just about like her trying to be the best person she can be, and having her own deep flaws that she needs to overcome as a result of that. Man, I'm drawing a blank. I'll think more about this, but I want to keep moving through questions because we're in overtime now. Not sudden death.
Shall I actually throw one in from the thing? Because there's the final one that I'm going to ask wraps in some of these other ones. So Matthew Faustino is asking, do you feel your writing has helped people in any way?
Man, I don't know. Is that even for me to say? I mean, look, anecdotally, people come up to me in cons or at signings or whatever, and will tell me that, they appreciate me as a Haitian American creator, and feel my pride in being a Black person reflected in the work. And that's always meaningful and intentional. I want people to walk away with that, if nothing else. I had people play Miles Morales and said, they could feel me in there. These are friends, like my attitude, my point of view, my warmth. It feels weird to say that about myself, but like That's what other people said. Yeah, so I mean, I hope so. You know, like at bare minimum, I hope my career and what I'm able to do with it shows um, that there can be space for people of marginalized backgrounds to participate in entertainment media at high levels. You know, that this can be a career. It's not always an easy one, but like, you know, I hope it's helped in that way. So yeah. Um, let's see. Okay. Anonymous attendee, how did you get into writing for video games? Was it an active process, or was it an opportunity that originated from from writing for comics? It was more the latter. You know, the first thing I got to do in a video game was writing one line of dialogue for Peter Parker in Insomniac's first Spider-Man game. It's something that Peter says when he takes a picture of the Wakandan embassy, and you know, I did it basically a favor and thought it was cool. But then they come back and say, "Hey, we're making a Miles Morales game. We want you involved." So, you know, I think that only would have been possible if not for comics. And the same thing with a lot of my other writing gigs. So, yeah, it was. You know, it's hard talking about like breaking in for other people because my story is so unique. But like, you know, the one thing I always tell people is like, figure out why you like what you like, you know, and I'm sure you're doing that in Professor Humphrey's class. Why you like what you like, deconstruct it. What are the moving parts? What are the mechanisms? What gets an emotional reaction out of you? And then figure out if you can do that stuff yourself, you know? Like, you know, so there's a scene that makes you gasp or cry or shock or get angry. Like, okay, why did I do that? You know, like, did it violate your understanding of the character? You know, is it part of a larger arc that you need to wait to see pay off? And then you think, okay, I think one of the things that you want to have any kind of storytelling career, and that includes nonfiction and journalism and stuff, is like um, when you're telling a story, it is you're performing the action of design, right? You know, so like if you know the whole story, you can figure out, how do I get to the end? How do I start off? How do I pull the reader in? You know, what's a turn that's dramatic and melodramatic, and what is a quiet moment, a moment of reflection. You know, like these are all tools that you have to use telling a story, and even when you're talking about real people, and you know, 90% of the time when we're experiencing storytelling in this modern age, whether it's a Twitter thread or something, it's designed, it's authored, right? So there's like some intentionality there. So figure out your own intentionality and how to bring that to bear through deconstructing the stories that you yourself engage with.
Just reeling that we're coming up on the quarter hour, so I think I'm going to wrap all three of the remaining Q&A questions into this last question, which is that you are in a virtual university space right now, and we've talked in previous interviews about broadening the talent pipeline for games and comics and animation and popular culture more generally. So if we were to brainstorm ways to improve the diversity, capability, and creativity of tomorrow's storytelling teams, what would a good education look like to that end?
Wow. It would be holistic and Catholic, not Catholic Church, but Catholic as in the old school term of the word, like being all encompassing, you know, like obviously I'm a humanities baby, so like I think humanities are very important. But like history, you know, and studying history from multiple angles, you know, like good world building, you know, take something like Game of Thrones, you know, which I've engaged with minimally. I haven't read the novels or anything like that, but I know enough to know that like there is it explores the effects of being sociopolitically marginalized, right? So like you can't write that from perspective of like not interrogating one's own privilege or the character's privilege, who has it, who doesn't. Like, you know, these are words that are like hot button terms nowadays, but like understand the world, you know, figure out different ways to understand the world from perspectives that are not your own. That's one way, you know. The other thing is, Alison, like I've taken to really starting to believe that like we can train storytellers in the same way that we train craftspeople, you know, like, do you need a 4-year college degree? And yes, I'm speaking in New York University space, but it's like, you know, like the socioeconomic barriers that prevent people from pursuing like a 4-year college education should not preclude them from being storytellers, you know? Like, just because you have a piece of sheepskin with your name on it from a university doesn't mean you're better skilled or talented than somebody else who doesn't, you know? And you know, you can train in animation, you know, with a lot of the off the shelf tools that are available to people who are not in the industry, and figure out, oh, okay, like, what do I have to say here? Like, you can do that with line drawing as a penciler for comics. You can do that with writing, you know, like, so I think, you know, broader mentorship networks that move through university structures, but also outside of them, like, are a way to help hopefully broaden and deepen these talent pools. But like, you know, I think that's the only way that these numbers, in terms of who gets to work in the entertainment industries, are going to change. You know, like, we have to rethink the vetting processes and the filters. You know, if the people who say they want to make this change are serious about it, you know, and I can't speak for them. I don't have that level of power, but, you know, hopefully.
That's a beautiful note to end on. Man, I could keep going with this for another hour, but I wanted to say thank you so much. The chair of the department, Sharon Hayashi, has just said in the chat, thank you, brilliant philosophy and approach as a creator, and such great questions. Everyone, I will second that. Thank you to everybody who's putting questions. I wish we could get to all of them, but I think actually Evan did a pretty good job of picking them up and knocking him down. So thank you, Evan, so much for coming to York. I really appreciate all of the inspiration that you've shared with us today, and very much looking forward to the next stuff. Is there anything that we should keep an eye out for? You can kind of hint if there's something that you can't.
Yeah, I'm doing some work for DC Comics, which I'm really excited about. One thing has been announced, and that's a Suicide Squad, Amanda Waller story that I'm co-writing with Spencer Ackerman, which I'm really excited about. Spencer's a good friend, but also one of the most knowledgeable people in the world about national security issues and geopolitics. So that's going to be fun, and has been fun so far. What else is coming out? Redfall is due out later this year. Yeah, there's one thing I can't talk about that I'm dying to talk about, so I'm just gonna be quiet now. But yeah, thank you guys for having me. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, class, and professional colleagues. I really appreciate it. This was a good time, and I'll come back. I don't know if I will have anything new to say, but I'll come back if you ask me.
We will totally have you back. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, and thank you to the Department for Cinema and Media Arts for making this possible. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
All right, take care, everyone. Thank you.